Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Holland Land Office Museum for the next edition of our guest speaker series. If you're not familiar with it, this is a program we do between 1 and 3 times a month where we bring in presenters from, we've had them from around the country to come and talk about various historic topics related to life here in Genesee County. But we're very happy to welcome back Derek Maxfield, formerly professor at Genesee Community College. Now he's, off gallivanting around the country doing speaking engagements just like this, but he came back home for us, for a special night. So he is going to take a break from his usual Civil War focus to shift backwards in time a little bit to the Revolutionary period with Dr. Benjamin Rush. So we want to give a thank you to Tompkins Community Bank and the Batavia Rotary Club for their support of the guest speaker series and concert series again this year. And thank you to GoArt for their support of this project. We received one of their grants through the Regrant Program. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge GoArt's support of this project. GoArt recognizes that this gathering takes place on the ancestral lands of the Seneca Nation, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and acknowledges their enduring presence in this region. So with that being said, Derek, take it away.
Thank you, Ryan. Well, hello.
Hello.
I see some familiar faces tonight. We don't really need this, do we?
No.
We'll just put this out of the way. Thank you for coming.
Welcome.
It is interesting for me. I get stuck in the Civil War so often that when I can play in my sandbox a little outside of the Civil War, it's kind of refreshing, Though I have to say I did it myself, Publisher comes along and says, hey, you want to write this for us? But, my first love wasn't the Civil War. My first love was the late colonial era and early Republic era, when some of these men who we would call founding fathers or founding mothers kind of emerge. And so, in some ways, it's kind of getting back to an old love, and the 250th gives us a wonderful opportunity to do that and to reflect on who we were and who we've become. I guess one of the things that, without getting too preachy about this, I hope as a historian people will get out of the 250th is an opportunity to reflect on who we said we wanted to be, and then over time, how did that happen? Did we achieve what we wanted, or did we not? Of course, all of this is complicated by things like the American Civil War, right? A great pivot in American history. But, one of the things that really occurred to me over 20-some years of teaching in the colleges is just how little students really get out of high school social studies sometimes. If you go through a school where you got a particularly strong faculty, it's a different story. But overall, having taught at 6 or 8 different colleges, either full-time or part-time, I can tell you that it's disappointing, generally. The knowledge that they bring to us about the founding, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, it's really shocking. And I really hope that the 250th would be an opportunity for us to remedy this, or at least begin thinking about how we can remedy this, Though I think one of the problems is that, maybe we have to first teach students how to think, and then go through those lessons. Because if they can't think for themselves and they don't know, looking online or looking at the media, what's right and what's wrong, what good is it going to do, right? All right, I'll get on to my soapbox. I promised I wouldn't go too far with that. So, let me tell you about what I think is one of the most fascinating, of the founding fathers that you might not have heard of. If you're in the medical profession, particularly in the area of psychology, you probably do know Rush and his name. That is the one place in America that still remembers Benjamin Rush. But outside of that, I find that people really don't know this man. And he played an interesting role in the founding that takes twists and turns that I think you might find an interesting story. So, ladies and gentlemen, please meet Dr. Benjamin Rush. So Benjamin Rush was born during an era that we call the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a name that historians have given to a period in history that runs roughly from 1650 down to about 1800, but it really sees its peak, kind of the golden age of the Enlightenment, from 1700 to 1800. And speaking of thinking, critical thinking, the Enlightenment introduces to Europe and then to America the idea that people don't have to rely upon superstition. They don't have to rely simply upon the words of a church or a religion. They can use reason to think about the world and make decisions for themselves outside of those influences, you know. And let's be honest here. Some of those influences can lead us to bad places, like witchcraft scares, right? Where at Salem, 19 people lost their lives, but that was one of the smaller versions of witchcraft scares. If you go back to 1650 in the area of Germany, hundreds, you know. Superstition drives people to panic, right? And religion, in some cases, can do that too. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but probably the bloodiest war of all time isn't one that you would recognize, probably. The 30 Years' War, probably the First World War. It ran, not exactly 30 years, but from the early 1600s down to 1650, engulfing most of Europe. It will take the lives of 50% of Central Europe, 1/3 of all of Europe. And the war was only about religion. Some of the bloodiest wars of all time, of course, are about religion, right? And in the case of the 30 Years' War, it was simply the Catholic Church against the rising Protestant denominations, right? And the Catholic Church didn't want the competition. One of the bloodiest, nastiest wars of all time. Anyway, the Enlightenment wanted to accomplish a reordering of the way we saw the world and how we depended upon knowledge, right? And the founding fathers, so-called, the men that we identify with the founding of America, were all born into this world. They were born into the Enlightenment. It was already well underway by the time they came along. And so, you know, by the time Benjamin Franklin and, you know, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and all these guys come along, this is the world they're born into. And so there's certain expectations then. If you are born to privilege, and most of these guys, let's be honest, were rich white men, you know, if you're born to privilege, you should be engaged with the Enlightenment. In other words, this world of learning and thinking. You should engage with it. You should learn about nature. You should learn about physics. You should learn about literature and politics and government and all of these things. You should be engaged with it. And it created kind of a class expectation at first. So if you are born to privilege, if you are, you know, upper middle class or rich, you know, that's just what you do. If you're born to privilege, you are engaged in the Enlightenment. Done. You know. But that will trickle down over the years to have more and more influence down the economic ladder. Probably, if you want to look for two Americans that most embodied the Enlightenment spirit, it was Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. Now, of course, Benjamin Franklin was never a president of the United States, but Thomas Jefferson probably is the closest thing the United States ever came to having the famous philosopher king. The philosopher king is an old idea that comes out of ancient Greece. A Greek philosopher once said, the best form of government would be ruled by a philosopher king. So you'd have a king that wielded power who was wise, very wise. But that same Greek philosopher said, the problem is while that would be the best government, it's not possible. Because somebody truly wise would not be interested in wielding power.
Yeah, that's right.
And so Thomas Jefferson is probably the closest we ever came to having a man who was a philosopher, became president, wielded some power. But both of these men, and what I mean by the Enlightenment spirit is both of these men, and certainly the man we're talking about tonight, were fascinated by the world. They were intellectually alive and curious. You know, both of these guys dabbled in a little bit of everything. You know, Benjamin Franklin, how many things did he do or invent? You know, he invented bifocals, he invented the Franklin stove. He experimented in anatomy. Of course, he experimented with electricity, which made him world famous, right? He dabbled in biology, he dabbled in science, he dabbled in government, right? And Thomas Jefferson, much the same thing, though his interest leaned more on things like architecture and beauty and gardening and botany and things like that. But both men were just so insatiably intellectually curious that they really show you what the Enlightenment was all about in the form of a person. Does that make sense?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
So, this guy, Benjamin Rush, is going to come along around the same time, you know. Now, when he comes about, now he lives in the Philadelphia area, you know, he's born just outside of Philadelphia, and, you know, he knew kind of early on what he wanted to do with his life. But he was driven to it because he felt that medicine was not being practiced properly. And he kind of learned this during his time at the College of New Jersey, what we would call Princeton today. So he got an undergraduate degree, and there started coming to kind of this firm belief that what we were calling medicine was more superstition. And that there were better ways to do this, right? Observing symptoms and keeping track of things and seeing patterns, right? And all of this. And so this time in New Jersey had a big influence on him. So did this man. His first mentor, you might know that doctors largely didn't go to medical school at this time. At this time, you could just hang out a shingle and call yourself a doctor and start taking patients. And there were a lot of these doctors in America at the time. Very few university-trained doctors in America. There was no licensing required anywhere. So you had all these small-town doctors that were really depending more on old wives' tales and superstition and some of them religion, you know. And Redmond had a powerful influence because Redmond was also the same kind of school. He had the same ideas as Benjamin Rush did about how medicine could become more scientific and less based on superstition. Redmond was the first doctor that young Benjamin Rush met that went to the world-famous Edinburgh School of Medicine. The most famous university in the world for medicine at the time was Edinburgh, Scotland. Now, Scotland had its own enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, which was kind of separate from the rest of it. A little bit more conservative on one hand, but more scientific on the other. And so Redmond took Benjamin Rush kind of under wing, and they apprenticed together, but Redmond then said, you need to do better. You need to go to Edinburgh. You need to get that education and bring it back and help me in America. Because what he really felt was that the British colonies were being neglected in many ways. It's not quite the revolution yet, but they were being neglected in many ways. There weren't enough colleges or universities in America at the time. And how do you turn out better doctors if there's no way to train them? And so Redmond thought, we need more of these university-trained doctors who can then take apprentices and teach those apprentices here in America better. Because they can't all afford to go to Edinburgh, of course. That's a big, long undertaking, very, very expensive. So Redmond was a very important influence. So he does end up going to Edinburgh for a number of years. By the time he leaves, he has the equivalent of a master's degree. And there he is introduced not just to the finest instructors in medicine in the world at the time, but he's introduced to the Scottish Enlightenment. He's going to spend time in London and Paris. And part of this was the doing of Benjamin Franklin. You see, at the time, we didn't have credit cards. At the time, it was less easy to give an endorsement of somebody. So we had letters of credit, which were kind of a form of credit card. So Benjamin Franklin, for example, extended a line of credit to Benjamin Rush to help him with his travel expenses, which was repaid eventually, but Franklin was a very rich man and he was in no hurry. But the letters of introduction furnished by Benjamin Franklin were even more important than the line of credit, because these letters of introduction opened doors that would not be open to you. And let's make sure we understand about the status of Benjamin Franklin in the world. He was he was one of the first world celebrities. World celebrities. His work with electricity, his work as an editor of things like Poor Richard's Almanac, had made him world famous. And so when Franklin made a number of trips to London, first as a young man and then a little bit older, boy, did they roll out the red carpet for this guy. Everybody wanted to meet Benjamin Franklin. They came from all over Europe to meet Benjamin Franklin. And it was largely about his work with electricity that just became so world famous, The likes of Voltaire and David Hume and all of these big names. He got introduced to royalty throughout Europe, And the University of Edinburgh, where Franklin was never a student, gave Franklin a doctorate for his work with electricity. Not the honorary kind, the real darn thing. And that only added to his reputation, right? So if you've got a letter of introduction signed Benjamin Franklin, that's going to open up all kinds of doors for you. And so that was a great benefit. A great benefit. So Rush spends, I think, about 5 years. Only a couple of years were those spent at Edinburgh. The rest of the time he's touring Europe and meeting all of these people. Franklin was in Europe for part of this time, and so they got together there in London. And he did kind of a small version of the world tour that rich boys at the time often would do. But this was so valuable because it gave him a larger view of the world and humankind, which I think is a healthy thing. Because I think that if you don't travel outside of America and you don't want to learn about other people and other cultures, you get kind of a narrow view, And also, oftentimes you don't appreciate what you have in America until you've seen around the world. Because the dire poverty in parts of Europe at the time, there was no like in America at that time. That's still in the future, So this broadened worldview was very important. By the time Rush comes home, he's already been offered a job as a professor of chemistry at America's first medical school. This was started in Philadelphia about this time, the College of Philadelphia. John Redmond is going to be one of the professors there, which you can bet had an influence on Rush getting this appointment. But he comes home to a job, right? And he, in addition to that, he's going to start taking patients and building a medical profession of his very own, taking on apprentices. This is going to be a busy guy, really busy guy. So there he is as a young man. But when you look at this portrait, now in this portrait he's about 23. He's not a particularly young man. But doesn't that portrait tell you things already about this guy, right? He's clearly not a ditch digger or a bricklayer, right? Clearly he's a gentleman by the way that he's dressed, right? He also has, it also demonstrates a bit of a European influence when you consider the French lace at his cuffs, you know? So, you know, Europe came back home with him in some ways. What you see here is a lancet. This is kind of a primitive medical tool, but will become one of the main tools that Benjamin Rush will use as a doctor. You see, at the time, one of the leading ideas about treating illness was the four humors of the body. The humors of the body. So there was black bile and yellow bile and blood, and right? So the four humors. And if the humors of the body get out of balance, there are ways to rectify that. So you could induce vomiting. You could open a vein and drain blood, which was something that Rush might have liked a little bit too much, because this will become controversial after a time. But when he was at Edinburgh, they were still teaching that draining a pint or two of blood would make your patient feel better. And of course it does, because you start to feel lightheaded, right? You might even pass out, right? But they thought this is helping to balance the humors of the body. So that will be an important tool for him. Now, he will start his medical practice. My goodness, he'll have sometimes 5 and 6 apprentices that he's trying to train at the same time. He actually, you know, buys a home, and he buys a building next door. He'll start a pharmacy, an apothecary, you know, where his students will be responsible under his eye of mixing the medicines and making them available to people to come and buy, you know. But he didn't have time at first to go courting, to find a bride of his own. As a matter of fact, I think left to his own devices, it might never happen because he was so darn busy and he had his hands in everything. But while he was at the College of New Jersey, he met the Stocktons. So the parents of this young lady here, Mr. Stockton was a very well-respected man and signer of the Declaration of Independence someday. So an illustrious family in New Jersey. He had dinner with this family many times, but of course Julia, before he went to Edinburgh, was, you know, not marriage age yet, you know. But because he had so much interaction with the Stocktons, and the Stocktons really loved Benjamin Rush, it was always kind of in the back of their minds that this could make a right marriage someday, you know. Because you got to remember that marriage back then happened a lot younger than it does today. My goodness, you know, when I was thinking about this the other day, I'm thinking, you know, when I start looking at the ages of people that I've known over the past 20 years, students, relatives, the marrying age keeps creeping higher and higher. And the age in which people are having children is creeping into the 30s, mid-30s, right? You know, for me, to be 58. I didn't plan it that way. So it's an interesting thing when you start talking about somebody that's 15 or 16 getting married, right?
Wow.
But it wasn't all that unusual. I think she was 17. Julia was 17 when they got married. So that wasn't especially young, really. This turns into a lovely love affair that will be a lifelong marriage. And it worked out so nicely, you know. It's nice when you learn about something like that. Because a lot of the marriages back then, among the higher classes were kind of arranged or semi-arranged. You know, love wasn't always part of the equation. Unfortunately, the children that they have together, I think only 4 make it to adulthood. I think they had 8 children. They lost a lot of children young, you know. Benjamin Rush is also fascinating for his toleration. He was definitely outside the norm of society in Philadelphia. Now, you have to remember, before the American Revolution happened, slavery was pretty much everywhere, right? It was in New England even, you know. States will become free states later. You know, it was all over America. Though in the North, it wasn't agricultural. It was more domestic servants, you know. Whereas in the South, it was about agriculture. But attitudes toward race were, you know, quite different than they are today. And, you know, Philadelphia was close enough to the South that there was a lot of interaction with you know, the agricultural slavery of Virginia, you know. And Rush, you know, made his attitude known pretty early on. He comes back from Edinburgh, and, you know, the African-American community there doesn't have a lot of friends to lean on. You know, they want a church of their own, and authorities there were not very helpful in this regard. And Rush used all of his influence to help create the AME Church in Philadelphia. He is one of the founding members of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. Very close friends with Richard Allen, who is comes to be a very influential AME minister and kind of a voice for African Americans generally in the Northeast. The big influence, I think, I've already mentioned is, you know, the inspiration that Benjamin Franklin provided, you know. But there's going to be a couple others that are going to become increasingly important to Benjamin Rush. One is this man here. Does anybody know who that is? Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine is important because he wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. It was published in America in January 1776. It's one of the things that led to a conversation about independence for America. Very important influence in bringing about independence. How about this guy? John Adams. John Adams was, you know, a patriot and the second president ultimately of the United States. By the way, if you haven't read Chris Mikowski's new biography on John Adams, which is for sale out there in the bookstore, you should do it.
I have it.
It's good. Chris Mikowski is a friend of mine that we worked together in Emerging Civil War, and he's a great writer and a better speaker. So you should check that out. So let me talk about first Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine gets a lot of credit for things like the pamphlet Common Sense because it took very complex Enlightenment ideas that really just college-educated people could dig into and understand. But he took those ideas, boiled them down into common sense understandings so that even if you were an illiterate farmer, you could understand the point he's trying to make. Well, that finally did something that the American Revolution really needed. You see, as the American Revolution approached, those that were already on board were the rich and the close to the rich, you know. They began to see the influence pretty early. And they were highly influenced by Enlightenment ideas about rights. But the ideas that flowed from John Locke and Montesquieu and others, these Enlightenment philosophers, are only accessible to those that can read and understand, right? And if you can't understand the words, then you're not going to understand the ideas, right? So taking all of this complex stuff, boiling it down into simple ideas, simple words, that anybody can understand broke open the drive toward American independence by letting the middle class and the working class start to get in on this and understand what this is really all about. So I can't stress enough how important Thomas Paine is in all of this. But there's a story that you don't often hear, because it was Benjamin Rush that convinced Thomas Paine to write Common Sense. And as a matter of fact, Rush helped revise a number of the versions of Common Sense before it ever went to press. Now, this wasn't something that Benjamin Rush went out and crowed about, you know. He thought it was an important thing to do, and so he used his influence to help make this happen. Whereas Thomas Paine was new to America. He'd only been here a couple of years. He probably wouldn't have been able to see this into print that soon, you know. So that was an important thing. And this guy is going to form a relationship with Benjamin Rush that's going to be very important to both men. As a matter of fact, it turns into a lifelong friendship. And John Adams is from Massachusetts, you know. He comes down to Philadelphia in 1775 for the First Continental Congress. Later, Adams will attend the Second Continental Congress. That is the one that declares independence in July 1775. Well, who do you suppose was at the border of Philadelphia, I mean at the town border, waiting for the Massachusetts delegation to arrive, but Benjamin Rush. He was there to welcome them into his city, to show them around, to help introduce them to people, because he knew what was happening in Boston. He knew what the people up there were going through. He knew how the British were cracking down on the rights and liberties of the people of Massachusetts. And he strongly believed that the Massachusetts men coming down to represent their colony needed help. And so he was there, not because he was a member of the Congress or anything, because he wanted to help. He wanted to introduce them to people. He wanted them to feel welcome. And that is the beginning of a very long friendship, and a very influential one, because they will trade ideas over the years. Benjamin Rush will become his personal physician. Later, I actually have a slide about this later. I'll save that for you. So Benjamin Rush was never a member of the Second Continental Congress before independence was voted on in July 1776. Now, maybe you don't know this. July 4th really isn't the anniversary we should celebrate, because the vote to declare independence was on July 2nd. And John Adams, for the rest of his life, bitched and moaned because he believed the anniversary should be the 2nd of July, not the 4th of July. Anybody know that it became the 4th? Because that is the day when they approved the document, the Declaration of Independence. You see, it was two votes. One was to actually declare independence. The second vote was on July 4th that approved the document, the Declaration of Independence. Two separate votes. So John Adams always began celebrating on the 2nd, did not stop until the morning of the 5th.
Yeah.
But there is the signature of Benjamin Franklin's the famous one, right? Benjamin Rush, just above Benjamin Franklin. Wait a second. If Benjamin Rush was not there and never voted on independence, either the Declaration or the Resolution, how is it he ends up a signer of the Declaration of Independence? My goodness, right? Because if you became known as a signer of the Declaration of Independence, that kind of etched your name in stone forever, right? Now, in the first years, it was risky, right? Imagine if we had lost the Revolutionary War, because if you had signed that document, that would be a death warrant, wouldn't it? Yeah, it would have been. It would have been. But that's not how it worked out. You know, all the men who were signers of the Declaration of Independence become famous as the founding fathers of America, right? And there's Benjamin Rush, even though he never voted on any of it. Well, this is really all about simple politics. You see, after the votes were taken and the deal was done, John Dickinson, who was one of the members of the Pennsylvania delegation, resigns from the Second Continental Congress because he's going to go fight the war. He's a colonel in a local militia, and so he quits the Congress. Well, that opens a seat for the Pennsylvania delegation, which Benjamin Rush fills. Well, one of the things that a lot of Americans don't know is, yes, they approved the Declaration of Independence on the 4th, but all the signatures did not go on that day. Really just a couple. John Hancock's went on that day. Most of the signatures are added in the coming weeks and months. In fact, the last signature on the Declaration of Independence isn't added until September. Anyway, when it came time for the Pennsylvania delegation to sign the Declaration of Independence, John Dickinson was long gone. Benjamin Rush had taken his place, and so Rush got to sign the Declaration of Independence, even though he never voted for it. Now, he was definitely in favor, and he would have, but it's an interesting footnote, I think.
Yeah.
Now, Benjamin Rush was a very jovial man. He was a very friendly man. But he also was confident in his own ability. He was confident in his own education. And he never shied away from controversy ever. If he thought he was right, he would go headlong into controversy, in fact. And one of the things that he believed through and through is that no one was above reproach. No one was above criticism. Even the great George Washington himself. Now we today have this kind of notion of George Washington as the marble man. You know, I can tell you over the years, I have not shied away from criticizing George Washington, but boy, you got to be ready to take the heat. Because people get upset. He's one of the Americans, there's just a few of them. He's one of the Americans you are never allowed to criticize, especially in front of American Legion. Know your audience, that's the lesson there, right? But you can't criticize their heroes because they start to get hot around the collar about that, you know? But George Washington was untouchable almost from the very beginning. It did not take long after he became commander of the Continental Army, even when he nearly lost his army on several occasions with bad strategy. His reputation only grew. And over the years, he becomes more untouchable and more untouchable and more untouchable, you know, until, you know, the war is over and he's a walking legend. And from the time he's the walking legend, and we're talking about the middle of the 1780s, that whole practice of you mustn't ever criticize him, you know, that really became entrenched very early. Benjamin Rush was nobody that ever believed in such a rule. And I'll give you the short version. So, one of the important battles of the American Revolution was the Battle of Saratoga, 1777. And the long and short of this is, you had a British army trying to come down the Hudson River Valley from Canada. And the whole idea was, you already had a British army in New York City, you had the British Navy out on the water. If you could control the Hudson River Valley, leaving garrisons along the way, with the New York already captured by the British, you could basically cut off and surround New England. Yep. That was a part of the British strategy, right? And so this is what the British tried to do. One of the big mistakes they made, however, is they chose the wrong commander, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne. And Gentleman Johnny was famous for his long supply train because he brought his mistress with him, and had 8 wagons dedicated to his feather bed, his collection of fine wine, gourmet food, you know, the tent and supplies for his mistress, right? So he's coming down the Hudson River Valley, and he's got this long supply line, you know, that was just too inviting for the Americans to ignore, you know. And what ends up happening is that the British were traveling slow and they got surrounded. And General Gates and his army, which had detached from Washington's Continental Army, surrounded and captured an entire British army. In 1777, about 6,500 men, all told. Which seems like a small army compared to the armies of today, but it was a substantial British army. But think about this. I don't know how much you know about English history. When was the last time, before 1777, that an entire British army had been captured intact? You've got to go back a long ways in order to find that. And as a matter of fact, through cursory searches, I have never found it. But I'm not a British historian, so I suppose I can be forgiven. But here's the thing. Americans, just a bunch of farmers with guns, captured an entire professional British army. And this was a terrible blow to the British because it hurt their pride, you know, and it leads to important consequences like an alliance with France. The Battle of Saratoga is that important, all right? Well, General Gates, who is the general that took the surrender of the British at Saratoga, becomes a big American hero, right? And then people start talking, well, wait a second, maybe we got the wrong general in charge, you know? When Washington was in charge of things, we got nothing but our butts handed to us. And now we put this guy in charge, and he captures an entire British army, right? America's always been, what have you done for me lately, in many regards, right? But there began to be this chatter, right, about should Washington be replaced, you know? Maybe General Gates is the guy to do this, right? And I don't want to get too far in this, because there was something called the Conway Cabal that really seriously started the campaign for this, right? And while Benjamin Rush was never involved in that conspiracy, the Conway Cabal, he did criticize George Washington because of the medical establishment for the American Army. You see, as a doctor, and as a well-trained doctor, he knew his stuff, right? And he became a medical inspector for the Continental Army, you know, in charge of a medical department. And he got out there where the armies are camping, you know, and he's seeing all of these troubles, right? Now, as a doctor, you think in ideals, right? What is the best way to deal with this? You don't think of halfway measures usually. What is the best way to treat this, right? And so he began lobbying for changes in the medical establishment for the Continental Army. Well, the problem is, ideals don't generally work on the ground when you have armies moving from place to place and you have these bloody battles being fought, right? Ideals, what you have to do is something practical, right? And so the changes that Rush wanted weren't happening. He kept pressing for these things to be changed because it would improve the health of the men. Like something simple like, don't let guys with smallpox just walk around anywhere. You know, isolate them. Don't have them exposed to the whole army, right? But that's just one example. There's a lot of things that needed to be changed, you know. And finally, you know, Rush began to think, you know, Washington will tell me to my face in a letter, yes, I agree with you, these changes ought to be made, but behind the scenes he doesn't seem to be doing any of it. He doesn't seem to be pushing for any of it, right? And so what this came down to is kind of a rift and some indiscretion. One of the ones that really led to the biggest part of the rift was Benjamin Rush was a naive man in many ways. Trusted too many people sometimes, you know. And he was corresponding with Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was a firebrand of an orator. He would become governor of Virginia. But even I knew you shouldn't trust Patrick Henry with sensitive information, you know. And in the letter, he says some indiscreet, though indirect, things about Washington that were mild criticisms, right? Now here's the part that might have the American patriot get upset with me. George Washington, you have to appreciate the man's bearing and personality. If you met George Washington without an introduction from somebody he knew and trusted, what you are likely to get is a very stiffly formal hello. You might not even get a handshake from him. He was not a friendly man. He really wasn't. People that would meet George Washington often said he was icy. He didn't have a lot of close friendships. And one of the things that was definitely part of his makeup is he could not abide criticism. He had very thin skin. And so even the appearance of possible criticism would get under his skin, and you might not be forgiven by George Washington for even a minor slight, you know. And by the way, this attribute is one of the things that will lead to Washington retiring after 2 terms as president instead of seeking a 3rd term, because there was something called the Jay Treaty during Washington's 2nd term. Washington began to be criticized in the newspapers, openly in print. Somebody in Philadelphia even hung George Washington in effigy. Can you believe that? This is 1775. That was enough. I'm going home. I'm done. He couldn't abide criticism. He never could, you know. And Benjamin Rush tried over the years to, you know, patch things up, but Washington never was willing to completely forgive him or trust him again. Now, you may or may not know that America's had 2 constitutions. The first constitution was called the Articles of Confederation. We've got to keep an eye on the time. Ryan's going to kick me out at 1 minute after 8.
No. Right, he's going.
So, here we have the Articles of Confederation were the first constitution, and it was poorly conceived, and it was a disaster, all right? We write a new constitution in 1787. Now, Rush, being a Philadelphia doctor, is all over this stuff. He may not be participating all the time in all these conventions, right? But he's always got his ear to the ground. He's always talking to the major players, you know, and so he's got an influence, and he talks to everybody, and could sometimes be a gossip, you know. But the new Constitution, written in 1787, that's the Constitution we still live under today, you know, was written there in Philadelphia, right under Benjamin Rush's eye. And he was a very religious man. I don't know if I said that yet. Very devout Christian his entire life. And even though the Enlightenment sometimes shook his religion a little bit, he never left that devoutness behind, you know. And so oftentimes when you read his writing, you see him talking biblical terms, you know, or Christian terms. And he really believed that the second Constitution for America was a minor miracle. And you know, if you dig into the history of how this came about, I don't have the time to do that tonight, but in many ways this saved America. And it was something of a miracle. And the behind-the-scenes posturing, even to bring it off, was pretty astounding. Of course, Russia was privy to all of this behind the scenes. And so you see that he believed that it was the work of divine providence. And he would probably be quite proud that it has lasted us down to today. The darkest period of Benjamin Rush's life was 1793, with something called the yellow fever epidemic. Now, yellow fever attacks your liver. It's generally introduced by mosquitoes, like other illnesses have been.
Malaria.
Yep. But yellow fever was unknown, largely unknown to America. You know, there were outbreaks in South Carolina, but the first outbreak, serious outbreak of yellow fever in Philadelphia was shocking. Nobody knew where this came from. Nobody knew how to cure it. Nobody knew anything about it except it's deadly. It spreads rapidly. And nobody knew how to treat it or to save people. And so all these doctors, even the Edinburgh doctors in the Philadelphia area, are trying everything, you know, to save people, and half the time killing them by trying to save, you know what I mean? You know, you get a little bit desperate. And, you know, one of the reasons that Rush comes into controversy is other Edinburgh doctors, criticize Rush for not experimenting more, leaving behind things like the bloodletting, you know, and moving out of the four humors approach to medicine and advancing. Now, they're all hypocrites in my mind because they are all throwing rocks at glass houses, you know. But Rush was one of those that was the hardest working doctor in Philadelphia, and so he got around a lot. And one of the reasons, a lot of them were jealous of him. Let's be perfectly honest, you know. Now, I'm not saying that Benjamin Rush was a perfect man by any stretch of the imagination, but he was a doctor that didn't mind if you couldn't pay him. If you were sick, he would treat you, even if he knew you couldn't pay him, right? And so he built a practice by caring for the poor, spending hours and hours a day treating people who would never pay him, right? But building up a reputation for kindness and compassion that the other doctors couldn't come close to, right? And they got kind of jealous that among some communities in Philadelphia, he was unassailable, even when they thought his practices were controversial. Well, the yellow fever epidemic just took out so many people. You know, the numbers are somewhere between 30 and 50%, depending on who you want to believe. Took a huge toll on Philadelphia. And at the moment that this appeared in the city, people fled the city for the countryside, right? So the population of Philadelphia, first of all, drops by a third, right? Unfortunately, some of those people are going to spread the yellow fever outside of Philadelphia, the areas that might never been touched by it. One of his projects was the creation of a new college named after John Dickinson. This is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Lifelong believer in education. Invested his own wealth in opening new schools, advocating for education. He was one of the first to advocate for universal public education in America. And here's a guy that put his money where his mouth was. One of his great contributions to America, outside of being a doctor, was restoring a broken friendship. This is one of my favorite stories. So at one time, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, so there's Jefferson, they were so close. Their families were so close at one time, you know. They were on a first-name basis, and their children stayed with each other, and they dined together all the time. The Jeffersons, the Adamses were practically family. And then politics came between them, you know. And during John Adams' administration and then Thomas Jefferson's administration, it broke this friendship apart. And for years, they did not speak. Years, they did not speak. It was Benjamin Rush that nudged the two of them together again. They never would have come back together again because both men had large egos and prides, you know. And in fact, they never met in person ever again. But Rush at least made them pen pals again. And this is great for America because we have the published letters between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, the Adams-Jefferson letters. Do we sell those here, Ryan?
Don't have that one yet.
Oh, you need to have that. Adams Jefferson letters. And even if you think, well, that kind of sounds, kind of highfalutin stuff to me, and some of it is tough reading, wow, it's also warm and it's fascinating stuff. And what historians have taken from 10 years of letters between these men after their friendship was restored, invaluable. And Benjamin Rush was the man to make that happen. Now, I said at the beginning that one of the things that might make Benjamin Rush known to you today out in the American public is if you were in the medical field, particularly psychology, because Benjamin Rush was the father of modern American psychology. Because here was a guy that was the first to say we need to treat mental illness as an illness, not as an irretrievable condition. See, at the time, if you were labeled insane, and it could be just because you had a cataract on your right eye, could be a condition that we didn't identify yet, right? Conditions like Alzheimer's have been around for a long, long time, even before we had a name for it, right? But we used to have these institutions, like insane asylums, where you could be thrown into an insane asylum for any number of reasons, right? And they're just thrown away into a dungeon, locked away, fed occasionally, no attempt to treat them at all. No attempt. Rush believed that these people were not lost forever if, first of all, keep them in humane conditions, don't put them in a dungeon with a bed of straw, give them sunlight and healthy food, observe them and see if there's the chance that you could retrieve them through treatment. And so he was a pioneer of mental illness in America and had a long-lasting influence. Medical schools, well, those that study the mind, still read some of the texts that Benjamin Rush wrote.
Wow.
This seems like trivia, but I think it's important. Have you heard of the Lewis and Clark expedition?
Yes.
That Thomas Jefferson sent these men to explore what we purchased in the West? Benjamin Rush trained William Rogers and Clark in medicine. Gave them a medical kit, a first aid kit, pre-made medicines, taught them how to treat simple illnesses. They took that knowledge with them and it was used on many important occasions, helping to save the lives of these men more than once. Here you see a portion of a letter between Adams and Jefferson. Now, Benjamin Rush dies before either one of these men. He makes it, I think, to 1816, just a couple of years after the war. But he was older than these men, so he's off the scene. But the friendship that he brought back together has been very, very important to America. And there you see, so I guess it was 1813. You can see there on his tombstone. He's buried in the same graveyard as Benjamin Franklin there in Philadelphia. You can visit Christ Churchyard and pay tribute to Benjamin Rush if you wish. And that's where I will end for the night before Ryan throws me out. Does anybody have any questions?
Brian will not very long.
He's had a long day.
Wow.
I threw a lot at you in an hour's time, but I promised I would not go long.
Wow. I know some of the stuff, but all of a sudden you're plugging holes and making more holes. They build more.
I could spend 3 hours on this subject.
It's-
I promised Ryan I wouldn't do that. Any thoughts or questions? Real. Okay, I did my job then. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you, you everybody for coming. Couple upcoming events. On Friday, we have a concert at 7 p.m. by the DSP Trio. So if you enjoy some jazz and other types of music, you want to come out for that, won't want to miss that. Then our next Java with Joe will be next Thursday, the 28th. And Richard Beatty, who is a volunteer here, will be talking about the community pool and then the community garden of Batavia.
Yeah.
They're on the same spot, so you'll get the history of both of those institutions and locations. And June 20th is a big event for us. We are collaborating with the Genesee County Parks and Genesee County Forest down there in East Bethany. We're going to do a program called Stroll Along the History Trail. It's a reenactment event. We're going to have close to 20 reenactors from all different periods there doing demonstrations and things, so you can go between 11 and 3 on Saturday, June 20th as part of New York State's Path Through History weekend. And also the park will be doing all sorts of hikes and things as well. So hopefully we'll see you at some of those events. You can check the website, check Facebook if you are a member. If you're not a member, become a member. There's my pitch for the night. You'll get our
June 5th.
You know, I always forget, Mike, so thank God you keep telling me. Another concert, June 5th, classical guitarist Tom Teresi, who is phenomenal, 7 o'clock that Friday night. You won't want to miss that one either. We have 3 guest speakers coming up in June on various topics. A lot going on in a short amount of time here at the museum, so hopefully we'll see you again sometime.
Is there a trivia night in June?
There's a trivia night every night, every month. That one will be, the next one is on Revolutionary War battles.
Okay.
So we're doing some military trivia for that. So, well, thank you, everybody.